Hello and welcome to Dubai Live. Thank you for supporting this channel, for sharing, subscribing and for liking the videos. Today's video is about the policy on domestic workers or helpers, people who work at home. Locally they are known as kadamas, but in this video we're going to understand exactly who is covered by this policy and what does the policy say. At the end of this video, you will be able to know who is considered a domestic worker in the United Arab Emirates, what rights the domestic worker has, and what are the obligations of the employer. The UAE labor law establishes the principle of informed consent, that is informed agreement, ensuring that the workers are aware of the terms of the contract, the nature of work, the workplace, the remuneration or the payment, the period of daily and weekly rest as set out by the executive regulations and before they cross their national borders. Let's understand who is considered as a domestic worker or a domestic helper. It's not only maids. On the list we have number one, yes, housemaids. A sailor is also a house helper. Watchman or security guard. If you have a personal or private watchman or bodyguard or security guard, is under domestic workers. Household shepherd, household horse groomer. If you have someone who is grooming your horses. Household falcon caretakers. So we know UAE and the falcons, people love the falcons. If someone takes care of your falcons, or if you're taking care of someone's falcons, you are under domestic workers or domestic helpers. Domestic laborers, housekeepers, private coaches. If you're a private coach, you could be considered as a domestic helper, especially if you're not on part-time, if you're not like privately sponsored, then you're under domestic helpers. Private teachers, babysitters or nannies, household farmer, gardeners, chefs, private nurses, private pros, agricultural engineers if it's private, and cooks. All these people I've mentioned are classified under domestic helpers. So it's not only kadama or only maids. All these people, as long as you're privately employed for an individual or a family, you're under domestic helpers. So the normal labor law does not apply to you, but the domestic helpers law is what applies to you. Hiring process of a domestic helper. We have Tadbir centers recently introduced, and now they are directly involved in hiring of domestic helpers. The services of Tadbir are regulated by the Ministry of Human Resources and Emiratisation, and this replaces all agencies for recruiting domestic helpers in the United Arab Emirates. It also helps domestic helpers if they have some issues with their bosses. Let us talk about the entitlement of the domestic helper. Every domestic helper in the United Arab Emirates, including everyone I've mentioned earlier, has the following entitlement from their boss. I understand not everyone is getting these benefits, but you should know that this is your right. So do not use this video to go and demonstrate or fight your boss, but I'm giving you information. If you need any other advice, any support, legal, I suggest you talk to a legal advisor before you go and do something wrong. You can talk to your boss, but I don't advise any violence. I don't advise any demonstration, because this doesn't work well in the United Arab Emirates. Number one, payment of wages or salaries within maximum of 10 days after the end of the service period or a payment period as stipulated in the contract. If you're said to be paid 1,000 dirhams at the end of the contract, maximum 10 days after the end of the month, you should get your payment in full. That's number one. Every domestic worker in the United Arab Emirates is entitled to at least a day of rest, at least 1 day of rest every week. If you get 2, you're lucky. If you get 3, you're lucky. But at least 1 day. And if you're not getting 1 day, then something's wrong with your employer. It needs to be discussed. Another entitlement for the domestic worker is at least 12 hours of rest every day, at least 12 hours. And out of the 12 hours, 8 hours should not be interrupted. So if either you're sleeping or doing something, but it should not be interrupted. At least 8 hours every day should not be interrupted, and at least a rest of 12 hours a day. I still understand not everyone is getting that, but that is what the law says. That's what the domestic labor law says. A domestic worker in the United Arab Emirates is entitled to 30 days leave every year. So every year at least you have 30 days of leave. You could break it into 10 days, 5 days, but at least every year there should be 30 days. And if it goes in 2 years, that means 60 days. A domestic helper should have medical insurance paid for by the employer. So the employer should not give medical insurance and then charge back to the employee or the domestic helper. It should be paid fully by the employer. A domestic helper in the United Arab Emirates is also entitled to 30 days sick leave in a year. So every year you are allowed to fall sick at least 30 days. But again, you should not pretend to be sick for 30 days just to cover up the 30 days. Otherwise, you will be considered unfit to work. A domestic worker in the United Arab Emirates is entitled to an air ticket back home every 2 years. So every 2 years, you should get an air ticket back home from your employer. This should not be cut off your salary. It is supposed to be paid by the employer after 2 years. A domestic helper or a domestic worker, kadama, is entitled to a decent place of sleeping, a decent accommodation. This should be a good bed, a good room with air conditioning, with all the basic facilities of showering, cleaning up. If you're not getting that, you should talk to your boss and let them know that it's your right to have a decent accommodation, a clean accommodation, a good accommodation for someone to rest, someone to keep some of their belongings. A domestic worker has a right to have food paid for by the employer. So a domestic worker should be fed by the employer good food, decent food, same food anyone would like to eat. I've heard of people who are not even allowed to eat or drink anything from the main house. Yes, if there's special food arranged for you, it should be decent food, not just food that is not liked. If you're not allowed to eat the main food, that's okay, but you should be provided decent food. Domestic workers should also get decent clothing or decent attire from their boss, from their employer. Many maids have uniforms, but it depends on exactly what you're doing. For example, if you're working in a farm, if you're a gardener, then you also need PPE protection to avoid having accidents when you're doing your job. So decent attire means anything that will be helping you to work safely, not only the clothing but also the protective gear. A domestic worker is entitled to keep their identification documents. I'm talking about the passport and Emirates ID. Your boss should not be keeping them. I know many domestic workers are not keeping their documents, but it is not allowed, it is illegal. The domestic worker should keep their own ID and passport. Now, especially that the visa is not going to be printed in the passport, yes, you should have your identity with you. Your Emirates ID should be with you where your visa is. In case of any misunderstandings, any disagreements, the employer and the employee has a right to refer a case to the Ministry of Human Resources and Emiratisation. The ministry will try to resolve a case within 2 weeks, but if it fails, then the case will have to go to court, where the judge will have to decide on how to close this case. And they'll always try to have a mutual understanding, amicable agreement, like a discussion or a negotiation between the employer and the employee to resolve the case. But if that doesn't work out, then it has to be forwarded to the court. At all stages, if a case is filed by the employee, the domestic worker, there should not be any charges. It is supposed to be free. So no one should threaten you, no one should scare you. You can file your case without any charges at any stages. But just have your facts right, just have your information right, then you can file your case. However, I should say maybe you'll be paying for the typing center, because the typing center will have to translate your case into Arabic. So you may have to pay maybe 100 dirhams or 150, but to the court you should not be paying anything. That's it for today's video. Now you know all the benefits, all the entitlements of a domestic worker in the United Arab Emirates. If you have been mistreated or you have had misunderstandings with your bosses, now you know what you're entitled to. You can discuss with your boss, you can negotiate with your agent who connected you to the boss, or you have the option of filing a case in the Ministry of Human Resources and Emiratisation. You will not be paying any fee, you should not be paying any fee, but consider all options. It's not always right to just go and report. You should consider all options before you think of filing a case. Thank you so much. Watch out for the next video.